All right, so we're on 1601, so let's get started. So I'm Tom Pugh from the core team of the International Tree Mortality Network, and I'm super happy today that we can have for you Paloma Ruiz Benito, who's going to talk about the work that she's been doing, or her group's been doing on tree mortality. So Paloma is an associate professor at the University of Alcalá in Spain. She did her PhD in Madrid and spent a few years in Sterling before going back. And her group has been working a lot on forest demography and particularly working with forest inventory data, I know, and really doing a whole range of things from field work to big data analysis to modeling. So I'm very excited to see what Paloma is going to pull out for us today. Just a couple of notes. So there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions during the talk, please just type them straight into the Q&A. And then at the end of the talk, then we'll go through those questions and Rupert here will read out some of those and we'll have a discussion around them with Paloma. So yeah, please just type them into the Q&A. Paloma, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I think I am sharing the screen now. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation to this talk today, and thank all of you for coming today. I really like the seminar series of the International Tree Mortality Network, and today I hope to bring some discussion about how a temporal perspective with observational approaches might help to further understand forest dynamics and their global change. So during the talk today, I will first introduce some general ideas about forest dynamics and the global environmental change. Then I will move to the effect of extreme compound climatic events on forest dynamics and the role of hotter droughts driving these forest dynamics worldwide. And then I will spend most of the seminar showing some of the challenges understanding and predicting climatic-induced forest responses, and particularly how I've been involved in some works addressing the role of multiple and interactive drivers, the role of temporal perspectives, how the past determine the present and the future of forests, and the role of targeted and specific fieldwork and research network to move from patterns to specific processes. So I wanted to start with this recent map of Judy Pan and collaborators that has been updated this year in 2024. In this map, it is highlighted the role of forests in the global carbon cycle. We can observe that during 3 decades, since the 90s, we have 1 bar for each decade, and we can observe that forests have been acting as carbon sinks in established forests, shown in green in the screen, and for tropical regrowth, shown in brown. Globally, forests have absorbed about half of fossil fuel emission during these 3 decades, and their role as a global carbon sink has been more or less stable over time, around 3.5, 3.6 petagrams of carbon per year. However, despite globally the role of forests on carbon storage has been stable, there are big differences depending on the regions. There has been important losses of forests in tropical areas and in boreal regions, and we need to further understand how forests that were forests in the 90s are responding to global environmental change. So to understand how forests are being affected by global environmental change, and this is a large-scale phenomenon, we need large-scale data and different modeling approaches to understand the patterns. If we locate different observational approaches depending on the spatial extent and the temporal resolution, as shown in this graph, we have different types of information, and I will focus on showing some examples about how vegetation inventories can help to understand responses to global environmental change. For those that haven't used this type of data, basically this data is gathered at the regional or the national level. They are not specifically gathered to understand the effect of climate change, but basically countries generally have this type of sampling efforts to know about the wood resources in the countries, the area of different forests, and other forest attributes that might be interesting, as, for example, forest biodiversity. The good thing about vegetation inventories is that we have coordinates that can link the forest level information with other data as climate, as soils, or as other spatial information that we are interested in. And in general, in different countries, they take some information regarding tree size, so we can calculate data about basal area, tree density, or heterogeneity, and they also gather information of species composition. So when we link it with functional traits, we can calculate different information about forest biodiversity, even functional diversity or functional identity. In many cases, or in most of the cases, inventories are measured over time. In some cases, we have permanent plots. And when we have these permanent plots, they are really nice to understand dynamics in forests because we can calculate information related to forest productivity, tree growth, tree mortality, and other demographic processes. So this information can be harmonized across space. During my PhD, I was involved in this EU project, funded project, where a group of people lead the harmonization of inventories in Europe. Here I saw a map of Fons van der Plas in 2018, where we can see the wide environmental gradient that can be covered by this type of data. So even that this data is not gathered specifically to understand patterns of global environmental change, we can use this data because they cover very large environmental gradients and very large biotic gradients. However, we don't have many functions. We have information about forest structure, some forest productivity, some demography, but we might be interested in other functions that are not gathered by this type of information. And in many cases, the orthogonality is not very high. By orthogonality, I mean if the number of samples are very balanced for different levels of the variable we want to know the effect. In the case of drought-induced impacts, I will show later, but this type of impacts are not very representative at the landscape level. So in many cases, it might happen that die-off or tree mortality events are occurring between plots, and we might not be gathering the complete tree mortality event because this data is not continuous over the space. However, we have a high representation of the reality with a high sample size. So now I will show just a couple of examples, one for forest productivity across Europe for all the forests, and later one for changes in the number of individuals across the species ranges, to later move towards the effect of drought-induced impacts. In this paper, what we tried to do was understand how forest productivity was affected by recent environmental change. We use as an explanatory variable temperature anomalies that are the absolute change in temperature over time. And we wanted to know if the effect of temperature anomalies on above ground tree mortality changed depending on water availability. So we cover an environmental gradient in Europe. We have information in dry forests, in temperate forests, and in boreal forests. And what we observed is that when water was not limiting, temperature anomalies had a positive effect on forest productivity. And in the discussion, because we didn't have specific data for that, we discussed that maybe these positive effects could be due to positive effects of global environmental change, such as increased CO2 in the atmosphere, leading to fertilization effects, or longer growing seasons. However, as we move towards the driest part in Europe, this positive effect become neutral or even negative, and we were wondering in which situation climate change is pushing forests towards their ecophysiological limits. In the second example, I will show is based on this theoretical framework of this nice paper of Anne Hampe and Petit in 2005. And what we might expect is that species are limited in the rear edge. This can be the southern distribution or the lower altitudinal limit of the species by water availability. Whereas in the leading edge, they might be limited by cold stress. So under changes in climate, we might expect a change toward the leading edge of the species distribution. And to do this, we work with Julen Astigarraga lead our work with the harmonized database under the Tree Mort ERC in Europe and in US, working with 73 species, and we calculated in this work how was the climatic sensitivities for these 73 species, and if the number of individuals tend to move towards the leading edge. We named this as climatic sensitivity, and we obtained that for 47 of the 73 species, this is around the 43% of the species, they tend to move towards these cold and wet areas of the distribution. So moving towards the compound effects of hotter droughts on forest dynamics, I have seen that this map has been shown in this seminar series many times, but I wanted to highlight that drought-induced effects on forests are occurring worldwide. They are affecting to many species, and this type of die-off events where very large biomass is lost due to mortality are not only happening in the southern limit of the distribution of the species, but they are affecting to many different species, many different biomes, and more and more cases are being reported over time. If we have climatic stress, such as hotter droughts, we might expect a spectrum of tree responses. So if the drought is not very strong or very intense, we might have first some leaf senescence, some leaf browning, and some premature leaf drop. As drought continue, it might lead to some partial dieback, and if it continues or there are even cumulative droughts, we might expect complete tree mortality or even below ground death. In many cases, there will be no recovery or it will be very slow, and it will mean very large biomass losses at the stand level. So from the initial drought, trees are resilient species, and it can take time to observe this type of die-off event with tree mortality. And in some cases, it can be quite rapid. So we are observing that hotter droughts are affecting to losses of biomass and forest productivity worldwide. However, in this case, they are not always happening in the southern limit of the distribution of the species. And in this paper, we saw that in many cases, climatic conditions, I will explain this a little bit later, together with some structural conditions, might be driving different responses to hotter droughts. And therefore, they are really hard to predict when this type of events might occur. So identifying some of the limitations we have with the data available at large spatial extents to understand the effects of climate change and particularly hotter droughts. In many cases, when we are working with observational data, attribution is very hard. So we have multiple and interactive drivers of observed forest responses, and we might need a specific theoretical framework to better understand why we observe a certain pattern. On the other hand, we might not have long-term data or very detailed data. So maybe we can have some information about forest productivity, biomass, even with landscape information. We can have some data about tree growth, but in many cases, other forest responses that are important for forest dynamics might not be available, as forest regeneration, tree mortality, or other type of data. And we need long-term data, although we will discuss this a bit later. And with this type of observational data, and particularly with point-ly data, in some cases, streams or stream responses might be underrepresented because These extreme events might not be widely distributed across space, but it's really important to understand under which conditions this type of responses might occur. So moving towards the challenges that we have understanding and predicting climatic-induced impacts on forests, I will move towards the role of having theoretical frameworks to further understand the interactive effects of multiple drivers. And here I wanted to focus on two different works. In this work that we developed when I was doing the postdoc in Stirling, led by Alistair Young, together with a very nice group of people working in drought-induced forest responses worldwide, we propose in this study to use the self-thinning framework to further understand when drought-induced responses might occur. For those that are not familiar with this self-thinning framework, what we have in the x-axis is the number of trees, and in the y-axis we have some variable related to the mean tree size. In this case, we selected leaf area, but in many self-thinning studies, they use diameter, height, or other variables. What the self-thinning propose is that there is a quantile regression. This is the maximum value that we will have in a certain area. And as we increase tree density, the mean tree size of the trees will be lower. What we suggest in this framework is that if we have an hypothetical forest, is the black circle number 1, we might have a period of benign climatic conditions and maybe some management factors that are helping this forest to grow. And under these relatively benign conditions, the forest will move towards increasing the number of individuals or increasing the tree size. As the circle or the forest stand moves closer to the self-thinning line, and extreme drought might affect the forest, and we can have this spectrum of forest responses, from leaf senescence to partial dieback or even complete tree mortality. So we suggest that forests closer to the self-thinning line, due to climatic suitability, good climatic suitability or management conditions, can be more sensitive to hotter droughts. In this other work, we move toward the specific effects of legacy effects of previous management. It's a forest that has been managed, but the management has been abandoned. And we suggest that we can use reference forests as a baseline scenario. So under a certain climatic stress, as for example drought, we can use reference forests to know how is the sensitivity of the forest. If we imagine that it is not always the case that the response to climate is linear, the slope of this relationship may be related to the climatic sensitivity to this forest. What we suggest is that in the cases where we have a very intensive management that has been abandoned, detrimental legacy effects might occur. So we focus this paper on detrimental legacy effects. There might also be positive effects, but we focus on the negative one and trying to understand which are the potential causes of these negative effects. What we suggest is a three-dimensional theoretical framework where we specify that previous management can have altered the distribution of the forest, so maybe it's outside the natural distribution of the forest, and in some cases, this exposure to new climatic conditions might lead to a more intense response to climate. On other cases, forest management can be related to the abandonment of forest management can have an effect on forest structure. So, for example, high-density plantations or situations where the root-to-shoot ratio has been strongly modified, and this can lead, in some cases, to high sensitivity to climate change. And in other cases, forest management can have underline a selection of species, and maybe the composition of the forest can be less adapted to the new climatic conditions. So we suggest that risk to climate change due to the legacy effects of previous management can be assessed through these three axes. So finishing with these challenges, we suggest that the combined effect of climate change and management can lead to hotspots of dieback, and using distribution, structure, and composition as surrogate of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptation can be used as a risk-based framework. Moving towards the second challenge, I will focus here on the need of temporal perspectives and how the past determine the present and the future, and to provide some theoretical framework in this work led by Xavi Serra-Maluquer. We suggest that some forests, this is an hypothetical case, just to show examples, maybe experiencing warming, this increase in temperature or BPD over time. And in many cases, some climatic extremes might change their regimes, as for example, more intense and more frequent droughts. What we suggest in this paper is that different mechanisms can lead to the fact that the effect of climate change might not be constant over time. So we might have some response, as for example, tree growth. As warming and drought intensify, maybe tree growth might decrease linearly over time, but maybe the effect of climate might not be constant over time, and maybe it is non-stationary. On a different demographic rate, as for example, tree mortality, we might observe a different pattern, and this is hypothetical just to show that the effect of climate change might not be constant over time. And as we have higher climatic stress, maybe we have some background mortality with some oscillations over time, but at some point we might observe exponential or linear, later linear increase in tree mortality, leading to this type of response. So we have observed, I shown just two examples about how vegetation inventories can be used to understand some effects of climate change on forest dynamics, but when we need wide temporal resolutions, we have other type of information that is very useful. Particularly, tree ring data provides information about tree growth, and there are very nice initiatives harmonizing this type of data worldwide. We might also have some information of remote sensing with some sensors as Landsat providing data since the 80s, giving a longer and a continuous information about forest responses over time. And I will show some examples about how we can incorporate temporal perspective to understand current forest dynamics. I will show one example with forest inventory data. And I said here long-term forest inventory data, but this is just 30 years of data. I will show one example where we link national forest inventory data with tree ring information to understand how individual vulnerability to drought determines large-scale demography. I will show one example about having annual information of forest productivity over time and the effects of hotter droughts on these responses. And I will show the latest example, just a case study in an area that is experiencing drought-induced forest responses, and how tree ring data and multispectral information can give nice information about these responses. So in the first example, in this work led by Julen in his PhD, what we did was to come up with a theoretical framework. We have here a structural equation model where we suggest that recent climate change, this is temperature anomalies and intense drought, might affect directly forest demography. This is tree growth and tree mortality, and might affect indirectly forest demography through changes in forest structure. We use data for 3 censuses from the National Forest Inventory available at that moment. We can observe here that the data comes from the 80s, 90s to a few years ago. And we have 2 different periods where we have tree mortality and tree growth. And what we did was to calculate the sensitivity to these increases in temperature. The overall effect is this black line, and we have tree growth and tree mortality. And we observed that for the first period, from the 80s to the 90s, we have a positive effect of temperature anomaly on tree growth due to the direct effect and the indirect effect through forest structure. But in the second period, this effect became negative. So it turned from a positive effect of temperature anomaly that I have shown in the first example with forest inventory data to this negative effect. Regarding tree mortality, we observed that the overall value had led to an increase in tree mortality due to increases in temperature, and this effect for the second period was stronger over time. For the second example, we link national forest inventory data with the tree ring network that has been harmonized by Chechu Camarero and Antonio Gazol. This work was led by Antonio Gazol, and we were wondering if the demographic processes at the national forest inventory level, tree growth and tree mortality, were underlined by sensitivity to drought, and we obtained the sensitivity to cumulative droughts through information from the tree ring network. So we did just an spatial join between national forest inventory data with the tree ring data that was closer to the plot. And what we obtained was that both tree growth and tree mortality were affected by cumulative drought impacts. In the case of gymnosperm forest, that is the brown color here, we can observe that tree growth decreased as the drought impact calculated at the tree level increased. In this case for gymnosperm and angiosperm forest, and in the case of tree mortality increased with the cumulative drought impact. These effects were stronger towards drier climate in the case of tree growth in the Iberian Peninsula. The third example, we were interested in testing these non-stationary or non-constant effects of hotter droughts on forest productivity. What we did in this case was using data from the Madrid region, so our universities here in the east, and we have information from 3 national forest inventories here, where we can calculate biomass. We have some LiDAR flights that can be used to calculate also biomass. And what we did was to obtain annual information for forest productivity using Landsat information, a model parameterized with Landsat information. So we have annual forest biomass over time, and we were interested in knowing if the effects of different dimensions of drought affected forest productivity. What we did was to calculate different dimensions of hotter droughts over time for this region. So we calculated the intensity of drought and BPD that is related to temperature and the evapotranspirative demand over time. We calculated also the frequency, the duration, and the accumulated value for this type of information. And we obtained 2 different axes, one related to temperature and one related to drought intensity. And what we did was to do models over time using time windows analysis. And we observed that the effect varied over time. So in this graph, what we saw is the parameter that is showing the relationship between temperature and productivity, and it's showing the relationship between drought intensity and productivity. And what we obtained in this paper, that Julian is right now finishing it, we obtained that over time, the effect of temperature increased and was more negative. It turned from positive values to negative values. And the effect of spate, because more intense drought are more negative droughts, also increased over time. So the sensitivity to drought and temperature increased over time. And we also calculated if functional diversity and identity had an effect. And despite we did not observe any general trends for functional or structural diversity, we observed that in the extreme droughts of 2005 and 2012 in the Madrid region, communities dominated by high P50s tend to show a lower productivity. So this was a nice example to understand how the effects might vary over time. And the latest example is just one fieldwork campaign done in Toledo in this Pinus pinea forest. Pinus pinea is a conifer very well adapted to Mediterranean conditions and sandy soils, as we can observe in the picture. And in this work, we observed in 2 years, where the rangers observed in 2 years an increase in 40% in dieback. What we did here was to take 31 plots, classifying different regions as high dieback, low or moderate dieback, and we wanted to know if individual and community responses between the 3 regions varied over time. What we obtain is that we have 2 different graphs. In the above one, we have basal area increments. This is tree growth at the individual level. In the second graph, we have NDVI, that is multispectral index that is related to forest productivity. And we obtain that in the first period, the 3 regions were overlapping their responses. We can observe here that in the 90s, we had a very strong drought in Spain, leading to this strong decrease in NDVI. But later, what we observed is an increase in productivity that was higher in high and moderate areas with dieback, and tree growth increased a lot on the individual level at this point. So we suggest that in this case, probably a reduction in density in this around mid-90s, 2000 lead to increased tree growth and reduce the drought vulnerability later on. So we observed in this low dieback, there was almost not dieback, and tree growth continue quite high. So we suggest that data integration from different sources and combining complementary approaches can be used to further understand drought-induced forest responses. And to finish with, I wanted to just show a couple of slides how moving from patterns to processes might help to further understand responses to drought and long-term forest dynamics. So in many cases, with observational data, we have information about productivity, growth, but in many cases, we don't have so many information about survival or regeneration processes such as dispersion or germination. Also, large-scale observational data in many cases is hard to attribute, which is the main factor leading to the observed patterns. So I like a lot this paper of Trumbo in 2015, where they suggest that global monitoring networks, as I have shown here some of them, like the inventory plots and other networks such as remote sensing, might be accompanied by specific fieldwork and experiments in areas where hotspots of forest decline occur. In fact, we are conducting right now a national project where we are comparing areas with extreme drought-induced responses with the close-by healthy areas. And when we were looking for places to do fieldwork in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, I was discussing some of these places with Francisco Lloret, with Paco Lloret, and during the discussion, he came back with the idea of the importance of having this type of networks, even at the national extent, where we put together a group of researchers in Spain working on drought-induced or climatic-induced or any type of forest decline in Spain. We have started to put together a database, but we are still working on that. We had some discussion about the importance of attribution, standards, and protocols, and we also might want to further promote and identify some regions where long-term monitoring might be feasible and act as a key network to promote transparency and to have some link with management. So far, we are 85 researchers and 26 research groups. We have very nice discussion about how even attribution or the identification of forest decline might change a lot depending on the field. So, for example, people working on remote sensing or dendroecology might have very different views on this. And we have started, well, Raúl Sánchez Aguero started to generate a management network to have a link with this network. So I would like to finish the talk highlighting the importance of long-term monitoring and research networks to move from patterns to processes to further understand and predict drought-induced impacts on forests, and highlight that many of the research shown here has been performed by a very nice group of people I have the honor to work with during my career and right now. And I'm very grateful mostly to a lot to the people I'm working with and I have worked with, also to the projects that are ongoing. And I would like to finish with the importance of open access and available data and the work that the governments are doing with national forest inventory data, remote sensing information, and other initiatives as the dry data. So thank you for your time. I hope you are still there. And let me see.
Wonderful. Paloma,
Yes.
thank you so much for your talk. This is really, really great. That's always the downside of giving us virtual seminars, that you don't know if people are still there, but I guess people were still there and are listening quite attentively. So this is really great. Thanks, Paloma. What I will do now is I will moderate the questions, and that basically means that people have been collecting questions in the Q&A, and for the participants, you can still enter your questions in the Q&A. I also ask for your understanding that we probably cannot address every single one, so we will do a little bit of a curation here. And I will start with the first one. Paloma, this question is by Pablo Paredes Berrios, and he asked about, if you were to plan a study on tree mortality in the field, what are the data from new sites that you would gather? So what are the variables in order to make studies comparable across regions? So what's the key, as I understand the question is what's the key variables to look at to also compare across larger regions?
To compare between fieldwork studies, probably. Or so it depends a lot, I think. In some of the, so for example, in the fieldwork example I saw here, we did a fieldwork design that we were aiming to be able to link it with multispectral information from Landsat. So we were careful that the plot size was comparable to this one, and gathering specific coordinates, because as we have some drone flights, we wanted later to link drone information with the field base. So I think, in fact, for example, in the project I was telling that I didn't show any results because we just finished the field work. We had a lot of discussions about attribution and when to consider that a stand has forest dieback. And we realized, because it's a coordinated project where we have people in remote sensing, people from dendroecology, and some of us that are more focused on forest inventory or ecophysiological responses. And we realized that in the field, defining what is a dieback and what a forest might accomplish to be able to measure it, it might change a lot. In fact, we realized with multispectral information, we were only able to detect die-off, is the work of Marina Rodés, if forest cover was higher than 60%. And in many cases in dendro, they are measuring forest with lower cover too, because for sure, if you have a forest that is experiencing die-off, tree density might decrease. So yes, it is not an easy question, but happy to further discuss about that.
Really, really cool. Thank you. The next question that we have is by Atticus Stovall, and he asks about, so he says, I'm curious if you looked at the adaptive responses of following generations of trees that the trees might have under more extreme drought and more frequent drought. So for instance, if the traits of trees might be changing under drought and how that might lead to changing forest functions.
I haven't looked into that. It might be really, really interesting. Yes, to know if there are some genetic differences over time. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I guess it's the genetics, but then also it's the trait structure in terms of, more like, do we see differences in the structure of the forest? Things that a lot of these like remote sensing approaches, like LiDAR and laser scanning, can really give us a lot of insights in. So definitely, cool question, interesting avenue.
Very nice. Yeah.
Well, our very own Cornelius Senf asks about modeling biomass from Landsat data. So I think you mentioned in your talk that you've modeled the biomass from Landsat data
Yes.
annually. Can you elaborate on this a little bit more?
Yes, so basically what we are doing is we have biomass calculated with national forest inventories across Spain from forest inventories. We have the exact coordinate of the plots, and then we have LiDAR information. So one of the things is that first we did, well, I participate, but I didn't lead that, a model where we have as a response variable the biomass with national forest inventories, as an explanatory variables, LiDAR-related variables. This LiDAR is a national these are national flights that may even change between regions. We use only Madrid regions because they are planned at the provincial level, but it's available for many parts of Spain. In Madrid, we have 3 different flights, okay, that more or less correspond with inventory data. And then we were able to have a continuous coverage on biomass over the space. Then with this data, but using only data where we have the inventory plots, we use Landsat information to make this continuous over time. Well, having one data per year. And this allows us to further understand how the effect of climate was changing over time on forest productivity. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. There's a lot of questions, so I hope you're still up for it.
Thank you.
We're moving on. There is one by Supai Chandra, and it's about soil moisture index, so more generally about soil moisture data and how this features into your analysis or into your data. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah. For most of the studies I've been working on large spatial extents, I have been using climatic databases available. And I wasn't, well, probably it's me, but I wasn't able to include soil moisture as a specific index. Also, in the latest work, we have been looking into this data because there are very nice works, quite recent, including soil moisture as a variable. But for the works I've been showing here, the data has been more related to water availability. So the relationship between precipitation and evapotranspiration, and in many cases, changes in temperature over time. So when I talk about recent climate change, I talk changes over time. And for latitudinal gradients, I've been using climatic data, but I agree that the soil moisture index is a very good variable that is recently available, well, recently, like, yeah, in the last year at large levels, and it might be a very interesting variable to check. Yeah.
Cool. I got to sneak a question in that I personally have.
Okay.
I hope that is fine. I was really intrigued and I really enjoyed your framework with these 3 dimensions where you had structure, composition, and then you had distribution. I think that's really illustrative. The one thing that I didn't fully get, but maybe I overheard, is like on the distribution axis. How do you score this? It's like about the core and the edges of the distribution, or is it something else that you're scoring there? I can understand the other 2, and I think it makes total sense. Also, you mentioned, the example with
Yeah.
management can influence these 2, but then with the distribution axis, I wasn't entirely sure. Maybe you could briefly elaborate still on this one.
Yes. Thank you, Rupert. So basically what we suggest with the distribution, that in many cases, when a certain management has been performed, as for example in reforestation or plantation, many species are planted outside their natural range. And when you have a forest because of the species selection that has been outside the natural range, in some cases, the new climatic conditions and the climate change may be beneficial, but in other cases may be very detrimental. So yeah, we focus on that. Yes, I've done some studies with forest plantations in Spain, and we compare the distribution across climatic space for the natural forest and the planted forest, and we realized that in many cases they were outside the natural range of climatic conditions. Even they were in the same area, like they were not very far away. So this is what is underlying this distribution potential effects on the.
Yeah, really cool. I think that's really nice because it adds kind of an ecological context, right? I mean, and the responses in structure and composition might differ with this context. So really, really cool.
Thank you.
More questions if you are still up for it.
Yes, sure.
That's really nice.
That's nice.
You had very nice time management, so this gives us time for a lot of questions, which is really cool. Yes, there's another one by Urgesa Mergar, and they ask about the impacts of diseases on mortality, and maybe it's in relation to the drought impacts that you study. Do you see any interactions or impacts with certain diseases in your study systems?
Yes. So yes, in the case of observational data that is available at large spatial extents, we have checked the information about tree damage at the tree level, and in many cases, or in some cases, when you observe tree mortality, there can be some information about biotic damage. As I was saying, attribution is really hard because with this categorical information in the inventory data, there were almost not climatic induced causes. So in many cases, you might have this, I don't know, like you have different factors affecting at the same time. And in the maps showing drought-induced forest responses worldwide that came from this seminar paper of Craig Allen, where they did a meta-analysis or a review of all the cases. Interaction with pests and pathogens were allowed, because later we did a meta-analysis in Stirling, led by Sarah Greenwood, and we were allowing this type of interactive effects. So in many cases, yes, drought-induced forest responses are interacting with this type of agents. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's quite high levels of complexity that come in, right? If we consider the abiotic and biotic interactions. Really good question and exciting research frontiers, I would say. Let me look at the list. There is another one, and I think that's also interesting, and I would also personally be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. And that is by Kovshik Raman. And the question is about the recovery. So what happens after the drought, basically? So what is in your study systems the recovery dynamics in these trees after drought? And do you see variation in species or forest types in that recovery dynamics?
Yes, we had this discussion in the group because in most projects I always focus on the impacts of drought. Some collaborators want to focus on the recovery after this type of event. So thanks for the question. I think we will move towards this in the future. But yes, in some cases, we might expect some species being selected. So I don't know. There is a lot of literature about that. And in many cases, some functional strategies might be selected after drought-induced impacts. Maybe some risk protein strategies, more linked to angiosperm species, but there are some debate about that. So what we observe is that in some cases, gymnosperm species are more strongly affected. It might also interact a lot with the conditions, the structural conditions in the forest, and so these strategies may be more promoted after drought-induced impacts, and is being observed in different case studies. But it is not sure how disentangling the role of drought between the role of forest management too, because in many cases there is also a management release, and it can lead to expansion of these species. So thanks for the question. Yes, I think we will move more and more to studying also the recovery patterns after drought. Yeah.
Really, really cool. One that Tom put in, and I think that's interesting. It could be interesting for a broader group of people. I mean, you've dove quite deep down into the inventory data, which is a huge treasure trove, and which I guess we have in many places of the world, luckily. I mean, do you have any advice for people wanting to answer similar questions with this kind of data? So what's kind of your lessons learned if, for somebody that gets into this data, wants to look at tree mortality or drought mortality questions with these inventory data, what would be your advice for people?
Yeah, well, I think it's very important to know very well the data because yeah, many people think that the data is there and you can use it straight, and I think that is not always the case, because for each study, for each objective, we have to select very well which is your universe, which type of forest do you want to study, which are the limitations or the advantages, because in some cases it's limitation and in some cases it are disadvantages, because comparison is not always straightforward, and in some cases, in many cases when we were studying, for example, with the Spanish forest inventory data, effects of global environmental change, we are focusing on permanent plots. So this is not all the plots. Maybe we are missing the new plots, and we are working with forests that were already there in the 80s or 90s. So this has implications. So I think it's really important to know the background information, and to be careful about the assumptions we are doing when using observational data for the responses that we are gathering. Yeah, for the responses we are getting. Yes. So being careful about that.
I think this is really, really good advice, given that, data sets get more and more available, but I think that it's really, really crucial to also know what goes in there and what's underneath the hood. This is wonderful. Paloma, I would close the session here. I would thank everybody of the attendance, or everybody in the audience who asked questions and who was with us today. This is really great. I think it was a wonderful input. Paloma, I really have to say I enjoyed particularly also how you showed how bringing different data sources together can give new insights in tree mortality. So combining tree rings with empirical data, with remote sensing data. I think this resonates very much with a lot of what the Tree Mortality Network has been trying to propose and what's been out there. I think there's really, really wonderful examples here. Thanks for your input. Thanks for making time. And for everybody else, I can also announce that we will have a next seminar coming up early in 2025. So this has been the last seminar for this year, but stay tuned on the usual channels for the next seminar to come in the new year. With that, thanks everybody for being here. Thanks again, Paloma, for this wonderful input, and see you at the next seminar of the International Tree Mortality Network.
Thank you, Rupert.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.